Lorelee Siemens is a force to be reckoned with. I'll tell you what, this episode I was so excited about. I mean, she is a podcast host of multiple podcasts. She is a voiceover artist. She has adopted kids. She just has this wild, awesome testimony that's just so powerful, so full of just the grace of God and God moving in her life. And I actually discovered her myself because I am because of this podcast, I'm part of a Christian podcast association. It's just like a Facebook page. And so I actually found her. I was scrolling through this Facebook page, just looking at people, and I came across a post from her podcast, which I hadn't heard of her or her podcast before. And she has a podcast called Church History. And so I went on and I listened to one of her podcasts, and it was so awesome. I won't go into all the details about it because it's church history, right? So there's a lot to it. But there was one that you guys saw me post. Those of you who really pay attention, really watch this podcast, really listen to this podcast, you may have seen on my Facebook page and on the Facebook page for this podcast, you may have seen me post a podcast on the story of Christmas. And I'll tell you what, that is what locked in just how absolutely awesome Lorelee is, because she is a teacher for sure. That is her gifting. If anyone ever questioned, she is a teacher, because I went on there and I listened to that Christmas podcast from her in her church history podcast. And I'll put the link to that in the show notes for this episode. And it was absolutely mind-blowing. If you are listening to this episode's coming out Christmas week. And if you are listening to this before Christmas, I'm telling you, after you watch this episode, make sure that you go back and you listen. Listen to this podcast that Lorelee has on the story of Christmas. And I'm telling you guys, it will completely change your perspective of Christmas and just the awesomeness of the Christmas traditions that we have. And it was mind-blowing, I'm telling you. So Lorelee, her testimony is incredible. God has been so good, and I loved being able to speak with her and getting to know her through this interview. And so, just again, if you want to support this podcast, you can always do so in the show notes at revivalcarriers.com through the notes here in the episodes. And also, I was going to just an announcement as well. Some of you may have noticed that the episodes, I didn't put out 2 episodes last week, and the reason for that is because I try to do this podcast the podcast is not just to pump out content, right? It's about what is best for you guys, the listeners, what blesses you the most, what is it that you're able to get how is it that you can get the most out of this podcast? And so I had received several notes from people. They weren't complaints. They were just people saying, hey, doing 2 episodes a week, because they're over an hour long, it's a little bit too much to keep up with. People love the episodes, they love the interviews, but I was putting out so many interviews that people were having a hard time keeping up with it. They were like, I just started listening to one, and then the next one comes out, and there's just not enough time. And so I just made the decision, I'm only going to be putting out 1 episode a week, so that, because for me, it's more about quality than quantity. And so I would rather have 1 episode a week where people are able to really get all of the juice out of it than do 2 episodes a week and then the people can't even listen to it and they're not able to really receive and really soak in what the interviews are about. Because I started this, I wanted to encourage people. I wanted to get people's stories out. It isn't just about pumping out as many episodes as possible. So from this point on, there will only be 1 episode a week. I'll be releasing these episodes on Tuesday, and that way we'll have some really awesome quality content for you, and you'll be able to keep up and just keep hold of what's going on here. So I think that's about it for for our announcements this week. This is Christmas week, so I hope you have a wonderful Merry Christmas. Make sure you go back and you listen to Lorelee's podcast after this, and it's only about half an hour long, and it's really, really awesome. I'm telling you guys, you got to go listen to it. So have a Merry Christmas, and I'll see you next week, and enjoy Lorelee Siemens.
Okay, am I on?
There you are.
There you are. Okay. I'm still getting used to Zoom and like how it works.
Yeah, I had never, ever used it before until this whole pandemic started. We were right in the middle of we have a missionary training school that we do for our ministry. And we were right in the middle of the school when all the lockdowns started, and we had to start using Zoom. It was a disaster.
Wow. But you can hear me okay? I don't need earphones?
Nope, I hear you great. I just use the earphones just for the feed to avoid the feedback.
Okay. All right. I know when I did a Skype podcast, and then I didn't realize it didn't work until I put my earphones in. So
Yeah, Zoom's a little bit different. Well, it's really nice to meet you.
nice to meet you too.
Yeah, I got to tell you, your podcast, well, you have like 5 podcasts. You have a lot of podcasts.
Yeah.
But your church history podcast is just, I mean, I think it's the best church history podcast that I've listened to. You are amazing in your podcast.
Thank you so much. I tried, when I was looking for one for myself, I couldn't find any that were like interesting, that like held your attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
Try to find one that was more like storytelling, less like college professory.
Yeah, you have like sound effects and everything. It's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
This morning I listened to your episode I listened to 2 of your episodes this morning. I listened to your episode on the Christmas one, the one that you just did.
Yeah.
And I was telling my wife, I was so like, it was just so amazing. I was telling my wife, I was like, did you know that the balls on the Christmas tree used to be apples? Like,
I know. That was really startled me too. I was like, what? I had to run upstairs and tell my parents right away. Like, now I feel bad that my tree is blue and silver. It should be red and green. Like, that was actually symbolic, but oh well.
Where do you do your research for this? Like, how did you find all of that?
It takes a long time because you have to sift through stuff too, right? Especially with church history. Like, especially when I was doing the Crusades. So I would listen to like Islam podcasts and Christian podcasts, and then like the stuff that they both said, I'm like, that probably happened.
Yeah.
Like both of them said it. Yeah. But I also have my dad's a pastor, a retired pastor. So he gave me his library. So I have all these books on church history. So
wow. Yeah, I've done quite a bit of ministry in the Middle East. I spent my first 2 years as a missionary living in Istanbul, Turkey.
Oh, wow.
And then our ministry, I go to Iraq and we work with Kurdish refugees there. And it's amazing whenever you get involved in you start to see the different perspectives, like you were saying, like the Crusades, especially because most Muslims, their perspective of Christianity is because they still teach the Crusades in school in those countries. And so their perspective is so different. That's why they're constantly calling missionaries spies, because
they think it's still happening. They think they never ended. The Crusades never ended.
That's right. Yeah. They because they see the Christians, they talk about being a religion of peace, and but then the Christians came and invaded their lands and murdered and raped and stole, and yeah, it was really intense.
Since you have that perspective, you'll have to go back and listen to the Crusade episodes, because I was like trying to like thread that line, right?
Yeah.
Of, like, there was evil on both sides, and
yeah, absolutely. And I just right before you logged in, I just finished listening to your episode on the most evil church in history, which that was absolutely amazing. Which, by the way, I am going to I'll put all this stuff in like the show notes and everything. But well, anyway, I want to talk about all these things, but let's go ahead and just jump in.
Okay.
And so first of all, thank you, Lorelee, for taking the time to do this, because I love your podcast, and I've been so excited about this interview to just hear from you and hear your story. On this podcast, the way that we always start is we have our guests, especially our first-time guests, just share their testimony first for our listeners, because we like to just establish kind of that relationship and to kind of know where you're coming from. So would you mind just sharing your story with our listeners?
Okay, so do you mean like my whole story, or just testimony of salvation, or
your whole story? Like you're the daughter of a pastor, so could you just start? Clearly you grew up in the church, so just start from there.
So my story actually starts like before I was born. It's important to do that part of the story. So my birth mom, she went through like a lot of really hard things in high school, got pregnant in high school, and ended up marrying the father of her child. And then that marriage fell apart, and she lost her child. And she had really at that point blamed God for everything bad that had happened in her life, walked away from God. And that's when she ended up meeting my birth father. And he's an atheist, hardcore atheist. And she's like, pretty much that's what she wanted, like the opposite of anything God wanted in her life. She ended up getting her son back when he was like 5. And she was almost in a car accident. And she prayed and said, God, if you get me and my son home safe, then I will go back to you and I will serve you. And she got home safe. So then she ended up going back to church. But her relationship fell apart at that point because he was like, you have to choose. You can have God or you can have me. Like, you can't have both. So she chose God. And so she had to walk away from that relationship. And so it was New Year's Eve. She was in church, like worshiping. And all of a sudden is when she realized, with all of the stuff happening in my life, I wasn't really paying attention. And, it's been a few months since like some things have happened. I hope I'm not pregnant. And that's when she found out that she was pregnant with me. And so then she said, well, God, like, I'm doing everything that you asked me to do. Like, I've left this relationship when I had to choose between him or you, and I'm come back to you. And now what do I do? And so she was just praying, like, God, just lead me in what you want me to do. And at the same time, my parents, who I have now, they were also in church the same Sunday. And my mom was praying because she had been trying for years to have a baby. They had adopted one boy who was 5, and she'd actually gotten pregnant, but she didn't know she was pregnant. And she went to the doctor because she was feeling really sick. And the doctor saw that she was pregnant, but saw that it was like a pregnancy he didn't think would work. So didn't tell her she was pregnant, told her she had like a growth that he had to remove.
Wow.
Yeah. So gave her an abortion, even though she didn't even know she was pregnant. Wasn't until she went for her follow-up appointment that the nurse was like, oh yeah, I see you had like an abortion. She's like, no, I didn't. I had like a growth that the doctor said had to be removed. And they're like, oh, okay. And then when she found her files, she realized that they had given her an abortion without her consent.
Wow.
Yeah. So she was really broken. And like, so it's like 2 broken women, right? Both praying up to God. And then, so my birth mom, she hid the fact that she was pregnant for a really long time, but just always like, God, I'm giving this to you. I'm giving this to you. Like, what do you want me to do? So when she started having to tell people, because like it got obvious, right away, all of her friends were like, this is the 70s. It's like free love and stuff. Like, just have an abortion. It's not a big deal. Like, just get rid of it. And like, you already have a son. You're already a single mom. Like, you don't have the money for this. You just got out of a relationship. Like, you don't want to go back to the birth. Like, all the reasons we give people, right? Like, not a good relationship, don't have money, already have a child. But so, I mean, obviously she considered it because it's the 70s and that was like the new women's lib thing, right, to do. But she met this woman at a women's Bible study who just kind of talked her through this and prayed with her and everything and talked to her about adoption. And so she went to those family children's services, say that she was thinking about adoption, but it was really important to her that it went to a Christian family. But she wanted to be really specific about what a Christian family was. So she like wrote out the gospel. It was like, it has to be somebody who believes this. So one of the things that just really like amazes me is that God was using me to share the gospel with people before I was even born.
Wow.
Like, what does that say, right? So my at the same time, my family had my mom and dad, they'd been trying for years to adopt. And the social worker had said, I think you need to leave out any God stuff because like that's like a turn off for people. And my dad felt God saying like, no, go in and be like super specific. Be like, no, I'm the opposite of what you said. He's like, no, we are a Christian. I'm going to lay out word for word what I believe. So like 2 social workers got witness to through that because they both got the gospel shared with them. And in my file was like the gospel. And so when I was born, my birth mom, she took me, she went into like a sunroom. She was in the sunroom, it was like really bright and everything. And she was holding me. And she felt like God saying, I'm going to take care of this baby. Like, I love this baby and everything like that. So she walked me to hand me over to the social worker, but because like she went from being really bright to really dark, like she couldn't see really well. And so she couldn't see her, but she could see kind of the light behind her. She felt like an angel, right? She's like handed me over to an angel. And then she heard God say to her, okay, you gave me your daughter and I give you my son. what are you going to do with my son?
Wow.
So from that moment on, like she went on to like really serve God. She worked in children's ministries, and she ended up marrying the son of the lady who had talked her through that process. They ended up opening a home for women who were like pregnant on the streets, so they wouldn't get an abortion, so they could like come and live with them. And then they ended up adopting 2 kids from that situation. So like she just went on to like really serve God. And then so then my parents, like I ended up going into foster care because she had listed out so specifically the gospel message, and they couldn't find anybody that matched that in the area where she lived. So I ended up going into foster care. And then they said, well, let's like go broaden like our scope of looking, because at the time that was illegal. Like you had to like stay within the one specific social worker network. So they broadened it, and like, oh, we have this file over here in this other town. It has like this exact specific thing as well. So then that's how I was connected with my parents. And the cool thing was, Gail, my birth mom, she prayed to God really specifically. She said, my birth father was a musician, so she wanted me in a home with music. I had a 5-year-old brother, so she wanted a 5-year-old brother. She loved pets and owned a pet store, so she wanted a house with pets, and she wanted a Christian family. So my mom has a degree in music. They had a 5-year-old boy. We always had dogs in our home, and my dad was a pastor. Like God gave her everything that she asked for.
Wow.
So then I was placed in a home with my parents. And my dad was a pastor. And so we ended up moving to Newfoundland, and I lived in Newfoundland until I was 15. But when I was 5 years old, I remember I was in church, and I was like trying to zip up my coat. And this is just a reminder, like when you're talking to little kids, there's always the time to share the gospel. So I was trying to zip up my coat, and I couldn't get my coat zipped up. And like one of the adults in the church came over to help me zip up my coat. And they said to me, like, are you a Christian? Like, have you ever received Christ as your savior? And I was so offended. I was like, I am the pastor's daughter. Like, what is your problem? Asking me if I'm like, I am not one of those people you witnessed to. Like, I was so mad. And then when I got in the car, I was talking to my parents, and he asked me if I was a Christian. And then my parents were like, well, are you? And I was like, what? What is this nonsense that you're talking about? And around that same time, we had a guest speaker come, and people don't understand, like in Ontario where I live now, or in the States, getting a guest speaker isn't a big deal. But in Newfoundland, it's like huge, because it's an island in the middle of nowhere. Like it's hard to get there. So when you have a guest speaker, it's huge. So it's a big deal. I remember sitting in the front row, so excited about this. And he shared his testimony, and he talked about how he was raised in a pastor's home, but didn't realize that he had to personally accept Christ. So it was that night laying in bed, I called my parents, and they came up, sat on my bed with me, and I remember talking to them and praying and accepting Christ as my savior. And I always tell people I was adopted twice, because I was adopted into my family, and I was adopted into God's family. And just the connection there, because when I was adopted, my name was changed. And I was adopted into Christ's family. You receive a new name, right? And you receive a new family and a new father. And so it's such a beautiful picture that God uses adoption as his picture of how much he loves us and what he did for us. So I didn't meet my birth family until I was 25. I started looking for them around the time I got married, because you think about getting married and having kids, and I didn't know anything. So I didn't know, was there mental illness? Was there like diseases, any of those things, which I wanted to know before having kids. Yeah. Like, is there anything I'm gonna like pass on? So I met them when I was 25. I found out my birth father had passed away from cancer, and so I had both of his parents. But connecting with my birth mom, Gail, and her husband, Dan. And so we actually travel and speak. Well, we did speak in churches when churches had speakers up until this year. So my birth mom and my mom and me, we go places and we speak together and talk about pro-life, because I'm a pro-life advocate. I speak about pro-life issues a lot, and then also about adoption. So that's my story.
Wow, that story is so powerful, because I know even just for myself, I've never met my biological father,
wow.
We spoke on the phone. I've never met him face to face. We spoke on the phone one time for a couple minutes, and it was after I was married and everything. I was 20, 22, 23. And so your story is just so powerful, and I love your testimony, because as I was doing some research on you, your Facebook page and your website, and just trying to learn a little bit more about you before we spoke, one thing, there is that one thread throughout everything that you do, which is about souls. It's about winning people for the gospel. And also you talk often about adoption and foster care. And so you speak quite a bit on this. My family's been involved in quite a bit of this as well. My parents they're missionaries in Panama now, but they fostered for 10, 15 years before they moved to Panama, and my little sister was adopted. And so in this arena of adoption and foster care, kind of what is your message whenever you go and you share in churches and events? What is your main message?
I kind of have a couple. One, I try to talk to people. I mean, I was adopted as a baby, and obviously there is still that need out there. But I kind of talk to people about thinking outside of the baby box, because there are so many children, especially like over the age of 8, that are waiting for adoption. And people are kind of afraid of that. I'm sorry if you hear a train in the background. There's a train that goes by.
That's okay.
It's going by now. So it'll be for the next 5 minutes. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. This podcast is so organic. Like I did an interview with a pastor a few days ago in his home, and his kids were coming in and looking in the camera, and so it's completely fine.
So yeah, I tell people to think outside the baby box and to think about older kids, because a lot of people are afraid of that, but I really encourage that. If you're, at least where I'm living, if you're wanting to adopt a baby, it's gonna be like 7, maybe 10-year wait. Meanwhile, there's lots of older children who are waiting. So that's one of the things that I say. The other thing that I say is everyone is supposed to be involved. If you're a Christian, you're supposed to be involved in helping take care of orphans and children in need. So God might not be calling you to adopt or foster, but he is calling you to help. So then connect with the foster family or an adoptive family that you can kind of come alongside. I know the first year that we had, as we adopted 2 kids, I know the first year when everything was kind of like crazy and I was trying to like figure out my space, and I had to quit my job because I couldn't handle everything. But someone, my mom actually, she just paid for 1 year of someone coming to my house once a week and cleaning all my bathrooms. So it wasn't like she came in and did that, because that would have been awkward and I wouldn't have been comfortable with that. But she like paid a house cleaner to come once a week to just do my bathrooms. And like, it's just something, simple things like that. I know there's other people who have like gifted a bedroom set, or I know one friend who has someone who does her laundry. So like once a week, she just picks up her laundry and then brings it back. So there's different things like that. So if there, or even just say like, hey, I'm going to be the person you can talk to, and whatever you say doesn't go anywhere, because sometimes you just need a voice to bounce things off of. So either stepping out yourself or going alongside helping other people. And for me and my husband, like, he wasn't really ready when I was ready. So one of the things that we did is I started a club for foster and adoptive families where they could drop off all of their children. Because one of the things when I talked to foster families and adoptive families, said like, what is something that you need? And they said, well, there's lots of things I could send my foster kids to through Family and Children's Services. There's lots of things I can send my kids to, like in church things, but I can't send my foster kids to those same programs because they have behavioral issues, or like they cause problems and it ends up being a big thing. And the Family and Children's Services events won't take my biological kids. So there's never any time when I can just, as a husband and wife, have someplace to send all of our kids. So we started a club. So one Saturday a month, all, like, you could send everyone in your family who was over the age of, like, I think we said 3. We didn't have babies. But then families, and we said, but this is for you and your husband to have a date. This isn't like you to clean your house or whatever. So it was a matter of us like feeding into the family by giving parents one Saturday a month, and it would last like 4 or 5 hours. It was like a fairly lengthy time. So there's things like that that you can do. And what might end up happening, which is what happened with us, is that you get involved in that space. God opens your heart and prepares you for when you're going to walk through that as well.
So I know just being in missions and being in ministry, I come across a lot of people who they have a desire to adopt, but there's this, or if even foster, but there's this fear of having a child, adopting a child who maybe has gone through some significant trauma or abuse, and there's a lot of fear in how to deal with that. What kind of encouragement do you give to people, or are there resources that people have for those kinds of situations?
Yeah, I would say family, Focus on a Family does have quite a bit of stuff, and they actually have phone lines that you can call in and talk to. Um, I don't know how it is everywhere, but here in Ontario, you have to go through training before you can foster or adopt, and they specifically talk about trauma. But then just taking ongoing, like reading books and constantly like teaching yourself on it, but you're still not going to be prepared. So you just jump in and trust God and like ask him to guide you. I still don't feel prepared, and I still feel like a lot of times I'm failing miserably. But you just jump in and do it. Like I was actually just reading today in my devotions about how Peter, when he was like asking if he could walk on the water, and Jesus like, sure, and how he like had no problem jumping in because it seemed exciting, like walking on the water, that sounds fun. And then once he got out there and saw the waves, that's when he started sinking. I think that's kind of what it's like. You're like,
Yeah.
that sounds like a fun thing to do. Yeah, I could totally do that. You can take all the training you want. Once you jump in and start walking on the water, you're going to see waves. It's going to be scary. But Jesus was out there on the water with Peter, right? And he grabbed his hand and pulled him up. So I wouldn't just say just jump in blindly, like do your research, but you're not going to be prepared.
Yeah, that's right.
God helps you to do it anyway.
That's right. Yeah, I love that. I saw, I actually posted on my own Facebook an image that I received from another minister that shows a graph of the United States. And I know you're in Canada, but a graph of the United States that showed the amount of churches that there are in each state compared to the amount of children waiting adoption. In some places, there are double the churches that there are children.
Yeah.
And it's such a travesty, because that it should be the responsibility of the church. Well, it is the responsibility of the church to take care of orphans. That's the Bible. And yet it's an area that the church has, like you said, failed miserably.
Yeah.
And it's really sad.
There's two things to that too. Like whenever I go and speak places, or even just on Facebook and things like that, I always hear people say, like that's something I really feel God calling me towards, something I'm planning on doing in the future. And I don't remember the exact statistic that somebody told me, but it was something like 70% or something like that of Christians have said they felt God calling them towards foster and adopt, something they would do in the future, but never did it. It's like fairly significantly large. So if you're feeling God leading you to do it, don't say like it's something I'm going to do in the future. Like start taking those steps now. And like I said, the first step would be connecting with a foster family and helping them so that you get a realistic idea of what you're jumping into. And then you'll be more prepared for it. But the second thing to that is I found churches are not, and I'm not saying this for every church. So if like you're writing, you're like, hey, that's not my church. Like I'm not be offensive, but from talking to multiple foster families and even from sometimes in my own experience, children's workers and youth workers, they don't have any experience with trauma, and they can sometimes do things that make it actually harder for foster families and adoptive families. I know like one situation was something as simple as they have a rule that like you have to stay in a certain age group in your classroom, and like no, our church doesn't bend on that. Well, you could have an older child, but there's something called stage, not age. And so when you go through trauma, you regress. So you might have a kid that's a certain age, but because of the trauma that they're dealing with, they've regressed back and they need to be in a different class. But the church would be like, no, we don't bend on that. And we know this is true, that if you're under trauma, you regress, because as adults, we do that, right? Like if we're stressed about work and there's something else going on, we get in a traffic jam, we'll have a full on temper tantrum like a toddler, right? Like we regress. So for a kid who's been through trauma, they regress, they just stay there a little longer. And so churches need to be willing to bend some of those rules. And there's other things too, where like maybe they need to stay with their sibling because they feel like if they're away from them, they go into like, they get really stressed, like something might be happening to their sibling, they might not be safe. Like I worked with one kid who, the church that I was in at the time was really strict. Like, no, you have to be in that group. But I could see how stressed he was. So like, and I was just young at the time and helping in the church. I would take him like every 5 minutes by his hand and like walk him over and pick him up, look in the window so you could see his sibling was still there and okay. Like every 5 minutes I had to do that because he was so stressed about it. So you can't be so rigid in your rules that you aren't able to like actually help the foster family.
Yeah, I can speak into that with my own children. I have 2 sons, and because we've traveled so much, my youngest son still has pretty severe separation anxiety. And so and we speak in a lot of churches as well, back like you said, like when we could. And a lot of churches we would go to, they would want us to put our kids in the children's church, which we're fine with. But some of them were so strict, they would say they have to be separated. And I would tell them, well, then they can't come in. They'll have to stay with us because I know my youngest boy, he doesn't know anybody in that children's service and he doesn't see his brother. He is going to be a mess. He's going to be crying. And so I always tell them he has to be in the same class as his older brother or they can't come to children's church.
Yeah. And one of the things I hear, like parents will tell me, because when I talk to parents, they'll say, the problem is that sometimes they'll be totally fine in church. And they'll be like, look, we separated them and they're fine. There's no issue. But what they don't see is that when they get home, that's when it all comes out and all the anxiety comes out. And like, you just have to trust the parent. And you also have to understand that they can't disclose to you the trauma the child's been through. That's illegal. So when they say like, you need to do this and this and this, just trust them and do that. Because if you knew the situation, you would agree with it, but they can't share that with you.
Yeah. Yeah. They actually are the church that we partner with here in Pennsylvania. And we love them. We've known them for about a year now that we've been here, and they're really great. They had an overnight sleepover for the kids, and both my boys went. And I didn't know this, but at night, as they got later in the night, they separated the boys. And my youngest son, he didn't complain. He didn't say anything during the event, but he was crying and upset for about a week afterwards because it's just telling us I didn't know where anybody was. I didn't know it was going to be so long. Where were you? Where was Elias, his brother? And it was really traumatic for him. And so after that, he was like, I don't ever want to do that again. So you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. So just trust them.
Yeah. So, okay. I want to kind of shift the subject here a little bit. I want to talk about your podcast. Can you tell us, because you have multiple podcasts.
Yes.
The one I have primarily listened to is Church History. But
that's
can you?
That Church History is my main podcast that I try to get out every week. And then I have some other podcasts that are just kind of like when I can, they happen. So my Church History podcast, we started with the life of Christ. Actually, we didn't even before that, and we did the like gap between the Old and New Testament in the first episode, and we're going in chronological order. So that is kind of interesting for me because sometimes I'll hear a story like when I'm doing research and then I realize these two stories in history, but they were like so close together, and it kind of changes your perspective. So we're going in order, but we're also doing it in storytelling format. So it's just very easy listening. Actually, a lot of my listeners are children. So sometimes at the beginning, like there's the one episode that we were talking about previously, which is like the worst church in history. There's another one that's like the worst pope. I forget what that title is actually called. But sometimes they'll say at the beginning, so kids, this is an episode your parents should listen to first.
Wow.
But a lot of homeschooled kids listen to my podcast because it's easier. It doesn't get super deep, but still, I think it's a problem that as a church, we don't know our own history. It's a really big problem. And kids today, and especially when they go to college, they're being attacked because they're saying that like the church was colonizing places, or the Crusades comes up, or the Inquisition comes up, or like all these different, or they'll talk about the Enlightenment and they'll say, well, society got better because we threw out God. And none of that stuff, I mean, it has like elements of truth in it, but not really. So if we knew our history as a church, then we can answer some of those questions. And we can say like, well, here's where the church failed. Here's where it did well. Here's the like time frame that the story you're talking about takes place in. And so some of those things make it easier. So partly I started it because I was homeschooling when I started. My youngest is now in high school, and I only personally for me, I only homeschool up to high school. So I was homeschooling and I couldn't find what I was looking for. So I just created it. So we're up till we're at like Isaac Newton is where we left off.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely, that's actually how this podcast started as well. This podcast has completely morphed. But whenever I started, it was because the mission schools that we run, for years I've taught on the mission field. And one of the things I always brought into my teachings was church history, and specifically missions in church history. And because as I was teaching a lot of these students, a lot of them, because they're missionary students, most of them, like yourself, they've been raised in churches, or that's why they're missionaries, because they've kind of grown up with that passion for the gospel and for souls and the nations. And usually there's some kind of relation there that was a missionary before them. So they know a little bit, but they have a huge lack of understanding of just church history and how we got to where we got. And
Yeah.
what I love about your podcast is because you teach you're much better at it than me, but you teach the details that I love, like the Christmas tree. And I love those little details that a lot of people, even just down to people don't even know how the apostles died. And so many things, they don't know what the Crusades are. They just see in video games, the knights that have the big, they dress them up as crusaders, and they don't know where that came from. And so it's such a powerful podcast. And I'm just curious. So this all came from homeschooling, or have you always had a passion for church history?
I think I had a passion for church history and didn't know it, because I always I loved, like, Corrie ten Boom is like my favorite person of all time, Amy Carmichael, and like growing up I loved those stories. And I was a Bible nerd as a little kid. I mean, serious nerd. Like for Christmas, my parents would be like, "What do you want for Christmas?" I want to like flannel graph and like missionary storybooks that I like. And then I would host, like when I was little, I'm talking like 7, 8 years old, I would host Bible clubs in my backyard. And like I'd go door to door, invite all the kids to come, but I needed like my flannel graph and like missionary stories so I could tell them. So I've always loved missionary stories, but I didn't really think of them as church history. I just thought of them as like, I love all these missionary stories. And for me, I just thought everyone loved all those and knew them. When I was an adult and I would talk to people about Amy Carmichael or Mary Slessor, and they'd be like, "Who?" I'm like, "How do you not know who Amy Carmichael is and be a Christian?" And so I was kind of shocked by like how they don't know. They know like the book of Acts, and then they jump up to like 1980. It's like, well, things happened in between Acts and 1980.
Yeah,
like,
the book of Acts and then Billy Graham.
Yes, exactly. So now I'm kind of going back. But then once I started really, part of me, I was like, well, maybe I'll just tell like those that from like 1800s on, because that's where I was already interested in. And I thought, well, I'll go back and start from the beginning and kind of work my way up. But personally, I thought I was going to be like super bored, because I didn't really like medieval-y thing. But I thought that once I got to 1800s, then it would get interesting. But once I started looking into it, I'm like, whoa, this is super interesting, like right from the beginning. Even when I started looking at the time frame between Old and New Testament, like before Jesus came. And I learned about Queen Alexandria. It was like the one of the greatest queens in Israel, and how like she turned the hearts back towards God, and how like Simeon was under her rule, and he saw like when she died and her son started a civil war and Rome came in, and Simeon was one in the temple who like had been praying for Jesus. So he had been there and like knew her, like they were like friends. So like to see that, like to have that connection, all of a sudden it just brought the Bible right to life.
Do you have an episode on that? I haven't heard that. That's amazing.
That's the very first episode.
Oh, that's the very first. Okay, I'm gonna go back and listen to it.
I'm pretty sure I put that part in, but
that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I realized I didn't even finish what I was saying earlier, but like with this podcast, it started because I've been teaching this for so long, well, it was because of the pandemic, and we were all in lockdown and couldn't go anywhere. I was sitting in my basement here, and I was just like, I was just bored. And I thought, I'm just going to sit down, I'm just going to just take some of my old notes and record an episode on St. Patrick, because people celebrate St. Patty's Day and they have no idea who St. Patrick was. And I've done all this study and research on him. So I did the very first episode that I did was on St. Patrick, just sitting in a basement with my iPhone, just recorded it. And I loved it. And so I kept doing more. But then, like yourself, I realized how much research goes into doing these episodes. It's a lot of research.
A lot of research.
But I fell in love with podcasting and wanted to do more. So I had a missionary friend from Iraq here who was visiting me. It's episode 3. And I told her, I was like, hey, you're part of church history. You're doing things for the kingdom of God now. There's things happening in the kingdom right now that nobody knows about. All these people who aren't famous, don't have books and TV shows and all that, but they're doing incredible things for God. And I said, well, you just sit down with me. And I had this super cheap snowball mic. Do you know those snowball mic? I had one of those. And I said, let's just sit down and we'll just record it. And I mean, it was the worst audio quality because it was just the two of us sitting there, and like we're in the basement under the plumbing, so you can hear like every time someone flushes the toilet and all that. But I loved it so much that I thought, man, I want to do more of these interviews with people who are doing things for God that most people don't know. And so I think this episode will be like 34 or 35, and doing 2 a week now, and just these incredible people. And so, yeah, I came across your podcast, which I was talking to my mom about you this morning because I was telling her about Christmas. And I was like, I was telling her, you got to listen.
I just did for the month of December. I'm kind of breaking away. I mean, it's still church history, but from being an order, I'm just doing Christmas stuff for a month. So
yeah, I'm so excited because I was telling my mom, I was like, I'm about to do this interview, and she did the most amazing episode. You got to listen to this episode. And I just love it. She asked me, how did you meet Lorelee? And honestly, I can't remember. I don't know.
Christian podcasting Facebook page.
That's where it was. Okay. Thank you for reminding me because I couldn't remember.
Yeah.
So
I found one of the things I found really fascinating with that Christmas episode was Santa Claus, because like finding all of the things that kind of intertwined into like really the whole church history with him, and how like he used to ride a white horse until they got to a country, he was telling the story that didn't have horses, so they just he rode reindeer. Like it's just so interesting how that all came together.
Yeah, I'm gonna take some of your material. I'm gonna credit you, of course, but I'm actually working on a Christmas special episode myself, and so I'm gonna use some of the things that you talked about, and I'll of course tell my listeners about it as well. But man, I'm looking forward to the rest of your episodes on Christmas as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, tell me about the other podcasts that you have, just for the listeners if they're interested in what else you're doing. Because I knew you also do voiceover work and you do podcast, you do editing. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So I do voiceover work for mostly Christian books. I do have a couple books that weren't Christian, but mostly people who have Christian books and they want an audio version. So I do voiceovers for them for Audible, and then also some YouTube channels I do voiceover work for. And then I do edit other people's podcasts for them. And then I have another podcast that's on adoption. And it was me and a friend who were kind of doing it together. And then she got pregnant out of the blue. It was really surprising because we're older and she already had like a lot of kids. So then that kind of got put to the side. But it's there. There's a whole bunch of episodes about adoption. So that's interesting to listen to. And then I have another one that's like the history behind the news. So I take something that's happening in the news at that time, and then I go like, let's look at the history. Like, let's look at like what led up to this that we're not getting told. And I kind of tell the history that leads up to that. And that same way I kind of try to do a storytelling format. And that's just whenever, like it used to be once a week, but my voiceover work has gotten to be so much right now, and that actually pays as opposed to podcasting. So it's kind of, that one's been hit and miss, but I do make church history once a week, but I used to have both of them be once a week. And then my dad, who's a pastor, he preached a sermon series on the book of Revelation. And because there is so many questions about that, I just took his series, created like a full podcast on it. It's not ongoing, it's just the whole series as one podcast. So that's up there. And then I have a few video series as well that aren't podcasts, they're just video series. I have one, Islam versus Christianity. We just take different topics and compare, like what is Jesus in Islam, what is Jesus in Christianity is one of them. I have one for children's workers, like if you're in children's ministry, just different things. I have a pro-life one, the abortion debate, and I have a euthanasia one, which is like the euthanasia debate. And each episode is like 5 minutes. You just pick one topic and discuss that. So there's videos and podcasts. And it's on LoreleeSiemens.com.
So you went to Bob Jones University, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah, I have several friends who went to that university. I have a bunch. Actually, one of the board members for my ministry went to Bob Jones as well. And so you're more in the you go to a Baptist church, is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just curious with your pro-life, and which is awesome. I am as well. But I'm just curious with everything that's going on right now. Just sort of, there's a lot of turmoil, particularly here in the United States with all this election stuff. And you talk a little bit about some of these things in some of your podcasts, and so I'm just curious in terms of pro-life. What do you think about like protests? I just asked this because I have a friend that I was talking to this morning who was arrested for blocking the door to an abortion clinic, and so I'm just curious about your take on that, because it's something you speak about.
Yeah.
How do Christians go about this stance for pro-life?
I'm going to answer that in two ways. So first, I'm going to say just protest in general as a Christian. I think that if you're participating in a protest, it should be about justice. It shouldn't be, we're not necessarily protesting. Like, you need to make sure it's not a selfish protest, right? So if you're getting involved in a protest, it's about justice and about something wrong. So I think the church protested slavery, right? And that's how it ended. So protesting against abortion to me meets that criteria because it's about justice. And then two, we have to make sure in your protesting, you're not breaking laws. So we think about like the protests happening in the States where they're looting buildings. Christians shouldn't be involved in that. Even if you agreed with why they were protesting, you can't be involved in that because they're stealing. That's sin. Like, so you can't sin. I can't say you can't break laws because some laws need to be broken, like Corrie ten Boom broke laws. But in your protest, you can't sin. Does that make sense? So I would say, is it about justice, and are you committing sin in your protest? Third thing I would say is, I love America so much. Here in Canada, we don't have, like, for one thing, in Canada, we have abortion for any reason all the way up until the very end. You can be like, you could go in and say, I'm 8.5 months pregnant and my marriage broke apart and I don't want this baby. Fine, you can have an abortion. You don't have to have any reason. There's a medical reason, nothing. In fact, there was a woman who was 8.5 months pregnant who wanted to get an abortion for no reason, no health problems, nothing. She just changed her mind. She went to 3 doctors who were like, dude, I'm not doing that. Like, I can't, I'm not doing it. She finally had her 4th doctor, was able to find a doctor who's willing to do it. Someone got up in Parliament, in our Canadian Parliament, and said, shame on those first 3 doctors. This is a woman's right. And here in Canada, there should not be any doctor who says no. Every single member, every party, I'm not sure if every single member, but every single party, including the Conservative Party, stood up and applauded.
Wow.
Shame those first 3 who didn't want to do an 8.5-month abortion for no reason. There was nothing. She just changed her mind. But here in Canada, that's completely legal. And we don't have, we do have pro-life groups, and they are growing more. So now here in Canada, our churches are basically silent. When I go to churches and say, hey, I'd like to come and speak on abortion, they say, well, we don't really talk about politics at our church. Like, we want to make sure everyone's comfortable. Like, it isn't politics. Like, yeah, we're murdering human beings. We do have the 40 Days for Life, which is great. And they do stand out and like hold signs and things like that. But we're not allowed. It's like the bubble zone for us that goes around any place that does abortion is like, I can't remember the length, but you're nowhere near it. It's like a mile. It's like huge. So we're like way off in a distance. So nobody going in to get an abortion can even see it.
So
what
do
I would
you
say,
go to the protests for it?
well, I wouldn't even call them protests. Like we just stand and pray, but I've
Yeah.
been to them. But I don't, I mean, we're praying. So it's the prayer that makes it, and it does make a difference because in my town where I live, well, not like I live in a tiny town, but the town nearby that has a hospital that performs abortions, they were going there and praying, and no one can really see us. So we think we're not making a difference. But what ended up happening was they couldn't find a doctor in the area who would be willing to continue doing abortions. So they have to fly an abortion doctor in one day a week. So now we know what day there's abortions happening because nobody, so the government is, and that's the other thing here in Canada, it's 100% paid for by our tax dollars. So you get abortion anytime and it's free. But now the government has to pay an abortion doctor to fly in one day a week to perform abortions. But that to me is the power of prayer, right?
Yeah.
Prayer is changing that. But I would say if you're in the States, like don't give up, don't back down to the pressure, because you could be where we are. And where we are, I don't see any hope really, because the church doesn't seem to care. Society doesn't really seem to care. And when you go to the 40 Days for Life, there's not usually very many people out there. It's not like it is in the States. So I would say if he got arrested for that, there's one woman here in Canada who did go onto the property and stand at the door and protest, and she's in prison, and I think she's gonna be in prison for like 20 years. Like and every time
Wow.
like she's in there, and the judge even said in his thing, well, your God is wrong. That's what he said in her thing. So she's in jail. Her name is Mary. But yeah, it's pretty bleak here in Canada when it comes to abortion.
I didn't realize that. I've never been to Canada myself, and I didn't realize how secular it was in that sense.
Extremely secular, very
So
much,
even
and you see that as well.
are the churches there? Because here in the United States, the church attendance has declined 1% every year for the past 20 years, and of course, with coronavirus, they're
Yeah.
estimating something like 25% won't come back to church.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know in Canada what's the state of the church like right now? Is it worldly, or what do you see?
Yeah. Churches here are smaller. Like here, a church with 400 or 500 people, that would be like a mega church for Canada. Like there's a couple churches that are really big, but for the most part, if you can get a couple hundred people, you've got a giant church. So our churches are smaller than in the States. I think there's more, and it's part of that is our Canadian culture, which is like get along, be polite, like you don't talk about religion and politics type thing, right? Like that's just more of our society. So that's in our church too. And I'm more of an outspoken person. I actually get that from my birth father. My birth mom says I am like the Christian version of him. As atheist as he was and strong-willed, I am like Christian strong-willed version of that. So I'm more outspoken, but people don't really like that. And even I was talking to a person that I know, I won't say their name, but talking to a person that I know, this guy, and he said something about how like during this pandemic, we're so concerned about this, but meanwhile, look how many people die from abortion. We don't care. And his people in his church got angry with him because they're like, how dare you talk about abortion? You're a man. Men shouldn't be allowed to talk about that. You don't even know what you're talking about. This is a woman's right to choose. And that was in his church. And that was an evangelical, like probably one of the stronger churches that I know, where like they actually do altar calls, and that's unheard of. Like there's very few churches in Canada that I know of that do altar calls still.
Wow.
That's not really, yeah, but it's
That's
very, very much more liberal than it. And I didn't realize how liberal we were in Canada until I lived in the States for 4 years. And now I went to Bob Jones, and then I went to like the churches around there, which is like Greenville, South Carolina. So I know I can't compare like America to Greenville, South Carolina, because I know that if I went to a different place in the States, it would probably be different. But when it came back to Canada, it was kind of shocking to me. Like, whoa, I didn't realize how mellow we are. And yeah.
That's
Social
shocking to me as
justice.
well.
Yeah, it's definitely, but things Canadian church does well is that they're very good at like reaching out. So like feeding the poor and doing that kind of stuff is more popular. But then like actually talking about sin and hell, that's not as much.
That's amazing to me. I mean, the reaction that this guy that that he got from his church, that's shocking to me, because that's the reaction you get if you say that in a public space here in the States, in like California or Dallas or New York. If you were to say that in a public space, you would get that reaction, but not. And I don't know of a church that would react that way, because most churches here are pretty pro-life. There are very few that would react that way. But here in the church, the problem in the churches here is they would applaud that guy, but outside the church walls, everything changes.
Mm-hmm.
That's really sad. Wow. Okay. So, we're wrapping up here in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to ask you, so if people are interested in having you do voiceover work or listen to your podcast, they just go to your website. Is that the best place to check you out?
Yeah, they can contact me through there. So just LoreleeSiemens.com. Pretty basic.
Okay. And your YouTube channel, is that or your video, it's on YouTube, right?
Yeah, well, all of my videos that I have on my website, I also have on YouTube, but I haven't really like put a lot of effort into growing YouTube, because I'm just assuming that they're going to kick me off like eventually, because especially with the pro-life stuff and the anti-euthanasia, because I don't know if you know, here in Canada, euthanasia is completely legal as well.
Yeah, tell me about that, because I honestly, just to be frank, I don't know much about. I know what euthanasia is, but I didn't even know it was like an active thing.
Oh yeah, so in Canada, and the law in Canada says that you have to be like nearing death, or death has to be imminent, but that's not what's actually happening. In fact, and this is really devastating. There was a woman who I think she was 90, or in her 90s or 90, I'm not sure. And she, her retirement home was going to go back into lockdown because they went to like red zone. We have like color coded stuff here. And she said, I don't want to live in a lockdown. And they told her like, well, if you die during lockdown, your family won't be with you. But if you die now with euthanasia, your family can be with you. So she died with euthanasia, like they killed her with her family around. And the only reason was that she didn't want to be alone and isolated in lockdown again.
Wow.
So, yeah. And we also had here in Canada, we had, this was like 2 or 3 years ago, that there was an elderly couple in Toronto, and they were completely healthy, just old. And they decided they wanted to die together. So they had like a party for all their friends and family to come over and like hang out with them. They went out to a restaurant with their close family the day before. And then they like had like a special doctor come in to their house, and they like laid in bed together, and they euthanized them. That's not someone who's about to die. So that's what's happening here in Canada. Like it's weird. Like there's even been people who've been euthanized, and then they've used their organs to donate their organs. Well, we know you can't donate someone's organs if they've been pumped through with poison, right? Which is how you euthanize. So how did they euthanize them? Like there's so many things that's happening. People, they don't realize how dark it actually is up here in Canada, and how many things are going on that people don't realize.
Wow, that just makes me wonder, because I've heard so many news stories. I don't watch the news. I don't pay much attention to the news, but some stories stick out, and oftentimes it's those that there was an older couple that they died holding hands, and I just wonder, like, that was in Toronto. Is that the couple that was euthanized?
Yes.
Oh man, see, they didn't even say that in the article I read. It just said that they had been married for a million years, and then they both passed away holding each other's hands. I had no idea that it was euthanasia.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, and they had, and their like children were like in the next room, like, because they said goodbye to them first, and yeah.
Wow, I had no idea.
And in the article that was printed here in Canada, it said they received death.
Wow. I'll have to research that more. I didn't even know that was active. That people, that to me, that sounds like Holocaust stuff, you know, like really like evil.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, Lorelee, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it was such an honor to be able to speak with you. And I love your podcast. I'm gonna be sharing your podcast on my Facebook page, just because I get so much out of it. And you actually gave me the idea. I didn't even know in this, that you did use your podcast for homeschooling. I am totally going to use that for my 13-year-old for homeschooling now too.
Awesome. Thank you.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, you have a good afternoon or a good, I don't know what time it is, but have a good day.
Okay. Thank you so much.
God
Bye.
bless. Bye.